This is the big story we have for you this evening. The agreement to disengage on the Doklam Plateau announced by India and China, and 72 days of prickly standoff. In a statement issued this afternoon, India's External Affairs Ministry said that expeditious disengagement of border personnel has been agreed to after exchanges through diplomatic channels. In another statement, the MEA said that peace and tranquility is an essential prerequisite for the bilateral relationship with China. The second statement came after China said it will continue to carry out patrols in the area. This agreement comes just ahead of the BRICS summit in China. Earlier this month, an MEA spokesperson had refused to confirm whether Prime Minister Narendra Modi will make the trip for this summit.
We remind the Indian side to learn the lesson from this incident, earnestly respect the historical boundary and the basic principles of international law, meet China halfway and jointly protect the peace and tranquility of the border region. The world is not peaceful and peace needs to be safeguarded. The Chinese military has the confidence and the ability to protect the country's sovereignty, security and development interests.
Despite everything, China is not giving up the posturing, asking India to take lessons from this episode. We'll go into the details of what has been discussed, what has been agreed to, and what it means for both sides. But before that, let's introduce you to the team that delivered Doklam, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who, in the spirit of true statesmanship, chose not to make any public comment on this matter, but led a diplomatic and military exercise of sorts that finally culminated in today's climb down. Significant among his moves was an informal meeting with Chinese Premier Xi Jinping in Hamburg during the G20 summit, where the two leaders met amid tension on the border. The next comes his deputy, National Security Advisor Ajit Doval, the brain behind India's China blueprint. He visited Beijing in July, and change in China's attitude was visible even before his visit. He was called a schemer by some in the Chinese press. After days of hostile remarks, China for the first time handed out an olive branch just ahead of his visit. Then we have Foreign Secretary S. Jaishankar, who in repeated statements said that there is no issue which cannot be resolved through dialogue and that all channels for discussion were open with China. This in the face of the bluster and rhetoric that we saw from the Chinese side. He also highlighted the trade interdependence of both the nations amid continuing Chinese saber-rattling. Army Chief General Bipin Rawat, while following the restraint of the leadership in the political sphere, maintained preparedness. He managed to get the centre to agree to the proposal of allowing army to make emergency purchases without going through the red tape. And finally, Sushma Swaraj, India's Foreign Affairs Minister, who went to Nepal and tried to rally support of regional leaders. Her statement in the lower house of the Indian Parliament also ruled out war as an option for either nation. Now, when the Chinese began constructing a road through Doklam, a pasture claimed by both Bhutan and China, Thimphu invited Indian troops to patrol the area. And since then, the rhetoric has escalated, as has the sound of war drums. Now there's an agreement, and both sides have ostensibly begun disengagement. But as always, the propaganda machinery in China is on in full swing. It is being projected as a pullback by Indian troops from territory they quote-unquote trespassed upon. As for the Chinese, they will stay on to patrol the area, say government mouthpieces in Beijing. So what really is the deal? Senior foreign editor Padma Rao examines that question.
To Indian troops guarding Doklam, a tiny pasture wedged between India, China and Bhutan, over which Bhutan claims sovereignty, they were merely guests of the Bhutan government. After all, China, a country renowned for squatting and land grabbing in all geographical directions, had started building a road cutting through Doklam without as much as asking Thimphu for permission to do so. The Chinese dug their heels in and refused to budge. The Indians fortified their presence along the eastern border to China, and war clouds gathered on the horizon. 73 days later, India's Foreign Office has issued a terse statement. In recent weeks, India and China have maintained diplomatic communication, it read, in respect of the incident at Doklam. During these communications, we were able to express our views and convey our concerns and interests. On this basis, expeditious disengagement of border personnel at the face-off site at Doklam has been agreed upon and is ongoing.
Indian forces and their equipment have already been withdrawn to the India side of the border. China's personnel on the ground have already confirmed this. China will continue to exercise sovereignty rights to protect territorial sovereignty in accordance to the rules of the historical boundary. As I mentioned, because the situation on the ground has changed, China will make necessary adjustments and deployments in accordance with the situation on the ground.
Tired of border incursions, India is nobody's fool, even less so under stentorian foreign policy direction emanating from the highest executive office, that of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This is no wilting flower PM, nor one who will bend over backwards to please. Though the Chinese statement is couched in the same tactics Beijing has employed for long, a slightly disdainful tone towards China and an implication of a Chinese victory and an Indian defeat, it is, in fact, the timing of the statements from both sides that indicates that it may be India that is having the last laugh. There's barely a week to go before the BRICS summit is slated to open in China. But without the I in the BRICS, that is India, China can either hold a lame duck summit with only Brazil, Russia and South Africa in attendance or, and this is likelier, be forced to cancel the summit altogether. And here's the thing, the Indian Prime Minister's office has maintained a stony silence on whether Prime Minister Modi will attend or not. Now, it's certain that India will both pull back its troops to its own borders as well as stick to the agreement eked out by its Foreign Office scrupulously. This is, after all, the world's largest democracy. As for China, and given the reported disagreement between the central leadership in Beijing and its People's Liberation Army, which says it will continue to, quote-unquote, monitor the Doklam Peninsula, that and nothing is a given. China and its PLA continue to violate all written and verbal agreements with all border countries on all its other maritime and land borders too. But is India worried? Not really. If Prime Minister Modi could stay resolutely away from China's One Belt, One Road initiative summit in May and grab global eyeballs for doing so, then he is perfectly capable of doing that again. After all, the BRICS summit is scheduled in early September and a lot can happen even on a remote plateau that has captured global attention before that summit begins. Padma Rao, WION.
And joining us this evening on Gravitas, Andrew K.P. Leung, international and independent strategist from Hong Kong, Atul Aneja, the China correspondent for The Hindu, with us from Beijing, Professor Swaran Singh, he's the professor at the School of International Studies in JNU in New Delhi, Meera Shankar, former Indian ambassador to the US, with me in the Noida studio, Vivek Kajju, former Indian diplomat and ambassador, joining us from New Delhi, Leela Punappa, former Deputy National Security Advisor from Greater Noida, and we will have Ainar Thangan later on the show, political and economic commentator from Beijing. So we have a full house this evening and a lot of eminent panelists. Good evening to all of you. Atul Aneja, you're sitting in Beijing. Let me come to you first. Is this a diplomatic win for India?
Well, I don't think we should call it a victory for either side because it is a very delicately balanced agreement which has been achieved. But what can be constituted a victory is that from here onwards we can move in a positive direction towards the negativity which had come in such an intense form with China almost threatening to a war, that has disappeared. So I think it's definitely a victory, but I think even the Chinese can say that it's a victory for them as well, given the fact that had situation become adverse, that would not have suited President Xi Jinping and his plans, first with the coming up the BRICS and the later plans which are already in the pipeline, like the Belt and the Road, the Asian Century, etc., which they aspire. So I think that the very fact that the crisis has been diffused is a victory for both sides, I think a victory for peace. And henceforth, we can look forward to a positive relationship between the two countries, but with caveats, because there may be certain exigencies which may have caused China to compromise. One is the BRICS summit and then the upcoming party congress which is coming up. So good thing has happened, but we can't let our guard down. But at the same time, if there is a positive opening which is coming out on the economic track and the BRICS and elsewhere, that should not be lost sight of it either. So it's a good balancing act which India should be able to conduct for here on. But on the whole, it's a positive development which has taken place today.
Okay, spoken like a diplomatic correspondent. Andrew, the point of contention was the road construction, and that has ceased from the Chinese end. So what do you think? Would you call it a victory for either side?
Call it a victory. But on the other hand, China is unlikely to back down on even road building. I mean, of course, it's not going to push it forward, but China is perceiving the road building is within its claimed territory. But I think that China also values the relationships with India. But if you look at the situation, the BRICS summit coming up is a big deciding factor for this engagement. If you look at the BRICS, all the other countries in the BRICS are on, well, except India for the time until now, on very, very good terms with China. You look at Russia, you look at Brazil, you look at South Africa. They are on relatively good terms with China. And then, of course, India could be the odd man out. But on the other hand, without India, and then BRICS is not that meaningful. So I think that both sides realizes this. And also, if you look at the military conflict, even Bhutan, even Nepal, they don't want a war, you know, sort of when they're wedged in between. So I think that all sides don't want the confrontation, and that leads to this kind of agreement to disengage.
All right, I'll come to the point of the BRICS summit and what could have clinched it and what led both sides to do what they did in the announcements. But I basically right now want to discuss what happened today. Meera Shankar, having claimed Doklam, China couldn't or cannot be expected to publicly now admit that it was mutual withdrawal. But by all indications, that's what it was.
It's not very clear because there are conflicting statements from both sides. The Indian side has talked of expeditious disengagement of border forces and also said that they had, this was evolved through diplomatic contacts and we had been able to express or convey our views and our concerns to China. But it hasn't said very much about the details. The Chinese side, on the other hand, has talked about Indian troop withdrawals and then in response to questioning has said that they will be making adjustments in their deployments but will also continue to exercise their sovereignty and protect their territorial integrity and sovereignty. So, you know, the statements are not very clear on what precisely has happened. But overall, it's a positive development. And I don't think you can say anyone has won or anyone has lost. But both sides have, recognized the need to avoid tensions such as this coming to define the relationship.
Right. Vivek Karju, where do you stand on this? Would you call it a diplomatic win for India, at least this round?
No, I think it's a welcome development, but clearly from the way the Indian statements and the Chinese statements have been formulated, a couple of things are clear. One, that both sides have moved away from the area where the troops were engaged. Also, the fact that the Indian side has not used the word simultaneous disengagement indicates that our troops were withdrawn first and then the Chinese followed. In the grand scheme of things, this matters little, though I would have been happier if it had been a simultaneous disengagement. Also, the basic objectives of India have been achieved in the sense that the road is unlikely to be constructed anytime future, and therefore we want that the understandings that were reached in 2012 about the maintenance of a status quo are not violated, and that is the point we stressed, and in that we've been successful. Finally, I think we've emerged from this as a far more responsible country because the Chinese went berserk with their statements and their posturing, and part of that continues even now. On the other hand, we were acting in a more statesmanlike manner, and I think our diplomats who handled this, along with the political leadership, need to be commended for the way they was successful in containing this and handling it. But my very last point is that I don't share Atul Aneja's view that all is positive between India and China relations after all, because the weight of Pakistan will always be there. There are outstanding issues, the NSG membership, Masood Azhar and all the terrorism. So all that will be there, but this issue for the time being has been, I think, diffused, which is welcome.
So I don't know why you're all shying away from calling it a win, because China had been asking for war. China had been saying, at least, that we will teach India a lesson, and then, well, we saw withdrawal from both sides, and the road construction was a point of contention, and to that extent, India's had its way. So that's how I see it. But let me take this to Leela Punappa. What are your thoughts?
I think we need to look, as I've said on your channel before, at the small, the local picture and the big picture. Of course, this is a positive development in the sense that what could have become a serious military crisis has been diffused. We have to read between the lines to gauge precisely who is pulling back at what stage. But the fact that the Chinese have also talked about redeploying their troops indicates that the disengagement that the MEA statement has talked about is in fact taking place. With regard to China's statement that they will continue to patrol the region, in a way that really is the resumption of the status quo ante. The big picture is that this signals that China will, as it has in the past, take steps to try to alter the status quo unilaterally. This is not the end of the road on situations like this. We've had Depsang before, we've had Chumar, we have now had Doklam, and even though it might sort of put a negative spin on this, I think we should be prepared for similar incidents elsewhere, because China will continue to try to probe to see how far it can go. What is also very significant is, I think, the fact that India took a position, it articulated it in a mature way without indulging in the kind of hysteria that Chinese government-sponsored media went to town with. There were no unnecessary statements. There was no attempt to negotiate through the press. And through it all, the steady message was diplomatic channels are open, and very obviously the whole diplomatic effort from both sides has resulted in this current diffusing. But this is just one stage in the larger picture of the bilateral relations. Both Meera and Vivek have talked about the other aspects of the Chinese engagement with Pakistan and so on. So let us not rest on our laurels. I think the signal for India is that it has to develop its capacities, it has to demonstrate its resolve, and it has to articulate its resolve. China needs to recognize that it has to see the limits within which its own rise can take place.
Absolutely, fair enough.
And I don't think any of this can be reduced into a victory or a win or anything of that sort. Diplomacy deals with continuum. It deals with stability. So let's not treat this as a football or a cricket match.
All right, point taken. Swaran Singh, we've been discussing this from day one, and we've analyzed and examined the twists and turns in this 72-day long saga. If this is the culmination, how do you see things?
I think you can see the sense all the other panelists is saying. Indeed, the nations left issues of victory and defeat way back in 19th century. Particularly larger states growing so rapidly next to each other with enormous complications, we only have to focus on managing relations better with each other with minimum costs and, if possible, maximum benefits. In that sense, we have an asymmetric relationship, and therefore Chinese were doing what suited them and India was doing what suited Indian diplomacy. And in that sense, they have ultimately decided that this whole mutual painful stalemate for 72 days is not taking anywhere. and have decided to go back to, I think, largely to status quo. What is reality on the ground? Indian soldiers had pushed Chinese soldiers back. So apparently they are not on what is being called disputed territory right now. And if Indian soldiers are moving back, obviously Bhutanese soldiers will go back and status quo will be brought back to where it was. But remember, Chinese spokesperson, even after being directly asked, did not say anything on the road. So we can't assume that they've given up on building that road or other intentions that Chinese might have. But we understand that in the short run now, the fact that Indian Prime Minister was not confirming his visit for BRICS, and that would have been a really big trouble for Chinese who are host of BRICS, and India being the second largest economy in BRICS, and indeed growing faster than China. So they had compulsions. And as Atul said, even the party Congress coming. So maybe looking at these compulsions of North Korea ratcheting up, making Donald Trump make some statements both against North Korea, China and Pakistan, maybe in the short run, Chinese compulsions worked in India's favor. And that is how we have ultimately arrived at some kind of a situation where India says standoff is finished and Chinese they are not contradicting it. So fact is, standoff is over. Actual processes on the ground, how they take place, I'm sure they have mutually agreed on who will go first and who will go later. But this is only first step. It may come back again, as some of the panelists have said. Particularly, India has to focus on Himalayan states. Chinese would like to cultivate them much better, so that next time when they get into a standoff like this, their levers vis-a-vis smaller states like Bhutan and Nepal are stronger. And this time it seems they stood with India. Recently we had the president of Nepal visiting India. So in long run, Chinese have learned their lessons. They will improvise their strategies. I think we have to do same in India. So far, our restraint, our calm suited us. And I think it has delivered us back to tranquility on the border. I think that's a good achievement. But victory and defeat is a thing of past. It's no longer useful. We have managed, and I think credit should be given to both sides.
Right. Vivek Kaju, I'm told you want to make a point.
A very short point. I think it's clear that for the time being, the Chinese cannot make the road. Whether they've not abandoned that objective is to be seen, and of course we'll have to be very vigilant. But if both sides are withdrawing, then obviously the road is out.
Well, if I may add to what has been said,
I think
the important,
just a second, ma'am.
I think the important thing is not to let down our guard, because the larger question of the border remains unresolved, and the definition of where the line of control, actually lies, is not clear. So there are grey areas. And if you see the pattern of Chinese assertion on their boundary disputes with other neighbors as well as with India, their tendency is to first change the facts on the ground, and then you can keep, complaining or protesting. So I think for India, it's important not to be complacent, to welcome this as a very positive development, but to be alert and to build our capacities, as Leela said. That's very important.
Leela Punappa, please go ahead.
Yes, while we are all glad that this crisis is over, let me repeat, we should not have any illusions that this is going to mark the end of a Chinese attempt to try to keep pushing its positions, its advantages, to try to create a kind of fake legitimacy with regard to its claims. There will be future incidents. This is not the end of India-China tensions. So far, so good. Our troops are pulling back, and the face-off is over for the present. But we should never lose sight of the big picture of China's strategic objectives and the need for India to develop its capacities and to articulate its positions. And I think this is a very important aspect of the Doklam incident, where India publicly stated from Parliament, from the official spokesman in the Ministry of External Affairs, what the government of India's position on this was. And the equally significant was that China was trying to divide India and its closest neighbor, as it has done in ASEAN, as it has done elsewhere in Asia. So these are things that we need to be watchful about. It's not the end of the story, but I certainly hope it doesn't get repeated too soon.